Anyway, it inspired him to found the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Please welcome Dr. Richard Gage, AIA Architect.
I want to thank all of you for being willing to take on the very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11 and the staggering loss of life that we had. It's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event because it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already over 1 million people have perished. As well, it served as the pretext for the loss, the controlled demolition of our own democracy in the Patriot Act 1, the forthcoming Patriot Act 2, the Military Commissions Act, and the forthcoming H.R. 1955 and Senate Bill 1959, the Homegrown Terrorism Act, which has some very, very real problems for all of us who value freedom of speech in this country. It could happen again. We are promised, in fact, another 9/11 and a worse 9/11 by members of the Bush administration, the Congress, and the media. This is extremely disturbing, and it is the reason that we have to peer into this painful part of our recent history to re-examine the relatively new evidence that we have not seen in the mainstream media, to find out why. For instance, a 2006 poll by the New York Times and CBS finds that 28% of Americans believe that the Bush administration is lying, and not just about Iraq, but about the events of 9/11. Of even greater concern, another poll that year by Scripps Howard Ohio University, which finds that a shocking 16% of Americans believe that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition. Let's just see here where we are relatively as a group on this issue. How many pretty much believe the official story that the airplanes hit the buildings and an hour or so later the fire weakened the steel and caused a gravitational collapse of the Twin Towers? Can I see a show of hands? We're going to actually do a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, about 5. How many are unsure? You're just here to learn. Let me get another count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, good. And how many believe that these Twin Towers were brought down by controlled demolition?
Inside job!
The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, thank you very much. You can put your hands. Do not point fingers at who may have been responsible. So we'll take we'll take a gander in some interesting directions. But I'd like to present to you tonight the unequivocal evidence that shows that all 3 World Trade Center high-rise buildings, the iconic Twin Towers and the mysterious Building 7, were destroyed not by fire, as was told to us by our government, but by controlled demolition with explosives. Let's first take a look at who I am. I've been an architect for 20 years. I've designed numerous types of steel-framed fireproof buildings, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and most recently working on a $400 million project in Nevada with over 10,000 tons of steel framing, much of which is fireproof, and it has mid-rise and retail and so forth. So I've been pretty busy. We have a website, ae911truth.org. You can avail yourself of a lot of information on this website. Some people say way too much. There's the bullet points of the evidence that we'll be going over in some detail tonight. There is the DVD, which you can actually watch online, or you can purchase it in the back. It's about 15 bucks. And you can step through the PowerPoint, point by point, and go into greater detail and refresh memory as we kind of whip through a lot of this information. At the end, we're hoping you'll sign the petition along with the rest of us. You don't have to be an architect or an engineer to sign the petition. Can we have the lights that are pointing on the screen off, please? Find out why 280 architects and engineers signed this petition demanding a new investigation into these 3 high-rise collapses. Find out why. Tonight, 36% of Americans believe that the Bush administration is actually somehow complicit. They consider it very likely or somewhat likely that government officials either allowed the attacks to be carried out or carried them out themselves. Now, I'm not saying this. This is the poll. Why do 51% of Americans want Congress to probe President Bush and Vice President Cheney regarding these attacks? And find out why tonight. 200 9/11 survivors and family members want a new probe. 110 military intelligence, law enforcement, and government officials. 170 distinguished professors. 110 entertainment and media professionals all are calling for a new probe. Well, we were all subjected to shock and awe. I know myself, I was watching TV that morning, and I can actually understand what I was seeing or why. We learned we were under attack only after being in the unknown for actually quite a while watching the TV. Thousands of Americans were killed the first time since Pearl Harbor. Our cultural icons were destroyed. Now, the 6 years since may have given us enough time to step out from this trance, really, that we were put into and begin to look objectively at relatively new evidence that has not come out in the media, and to re-examine these 3 high-rise collapses more objectively. Now, let's start by taking a look at what happened that morning and the resulting myth that developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes were flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just screamed right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
Why are people chuckling at this guy? Mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. It took engineers a year to figure that out. This is the first guy interviewed by a few different major media outlets on the street. And so that's why she says that the story was born right on the street itself. He's not in shock like everybody else. He's talking objectively. I witnessed da-da-da-da-da, and then he gives the reason. We have to be very careful about these plans on the street for these kinds of events.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked.
So what we want to do instead is take several steps back and start back at the beginning with the scientific method and see how NIST and FEMA applied the scientific method to justify the official story. So we're going to be comparing the fire-induced collapse theory carefully to the controlled demolition theory. We start by asking a question. How did the Twin Towers collapse in Building 7? We do background research. We gather data. We construct a hypothesis. Well, I think fires brought the buildings down, or I think controlled demolition may have been a cause. We do experiments to test the hypothesis. We analyze our results, draw conclusions, and if the hypothesis is false, we circle back again and construct a new one. We're going to look and see how this process played itself out with the official story. Particularly NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which we'll be talking about. If the hypothesis is true, we report our results in an open fashion that can be scrutinized by the public, particularly with a public investigation such as this. So let's think about the forces first that destroy buildings. We're gathering data, right? Controlled demolition can destroy buildings. Fires can destroy buildings. Buildings fall over in earthquakes. If they're concrete, they can collapse sometimes. Steel frame buildings have never collapsed in a vertical progressive collapse like we had on 9/11. Explosions are also damaging to buildings. Fires, by their nature, it's an organic process. It burns about every 20 minutes throughout the building and leaving an area behind to cool as it looks for more fuel. So when collapses do occur, and by the way, they've never occurred in a steel frame high-rise building, even though, as you'll see, we have 100 examples of such that have never brought them down. But say in a wood building, like this one. This is a brick building, thank God. But in a wood building, you have, when you have a collapse, because of the organic nature of fire, it falls asymmetrically. It falls over. It does not fall down through the path of greatest resistance. So let's start with these buildings fell over on the left, and we have collapses on the right. Now, when this happens, you still see a building at the bottom, or what looks like a building. The structure, is particularly in steel frame buildings, tends to hold itself together. It doesn't decompose into its individual elements, and the concrete in the floors is not pulverized. Even in severely damaged earthquake buildings, you tend to see the basic elements of the building. When buildings are exploded, you hear sounds of explosions, flashes of light. These different forces that act on buildings have very different and identifiable characteristics. As you can see, you have thick, billowing, enormous clouds, pyroclastic clouds with this cauliflower-like enfolding on itself, produced by the massive heat of the explosives. You have streamers, shooting streamers, up and out, lateral ejections of materials. Well, we're going to take a look at what destroyed these three skyscrapers, the two Twin Towers and Building 7. Most people are not even aware of Building 7. How many have never heard of Building 7? Let's just take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, it's a pretty educated crowd we have here. So we're going to apply this scientific method, gather data on controlled demolitions, because that's what we're going to focus on, see if it makes sense for us. Fortunately, we have all kinds of examples of controlled demolition from all across the country, because it is the most commonly used method to bring down high-rise buildings. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions, of course, can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove the structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the building and then detonating them in a very, very precise order, starting with the interior structure and working outward and progressing and start outward and then upward and then synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. The result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall speed, or virtually free fall speed, into a consolidated rubble pile, which is broken up and ready for shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. But things can go wrong with controlled
This building is about to be destroyed in what is called a controlled demolition. Buildings do not do this spontaneously. Here is another example of a controlled demolition. The initial charges are spaced about 1 second apart. and you can see that each section begins falling separately. Successful demolitions require that all structural support columns collapse at virtually the same time. If they don't, or if something else goes wrong, the result looks something like this.
It's not an exact science. Well, the typical features of a controlled demolition are fairly common. We have a sudden onset of destruction at the base. 2, straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. Do you all have this handout? It's similar to this. Say yes or no. No. Bill, would you hand out for this time? 3, demolition rates remove column support, resulting in a free fall speed, or nearly so, through the path of greatest resistance. 5, total dismemberment of the steel structure where it's broken up and ready for shipment. 6, minimal damage to adjacent structures by pulling the outside in. 7, sounds and flashes of explosives heard by witnesses. 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. 9, squibs or explosive cutter charges that go off at the wrong time. Sometimes we see these, sometimes we don't. 10, chemical evidence of cutter charges. They leave a residue behind. So now all of this is direct evidence for controlled demolition. And guess what? Fire can't account for any one of these characteristics, let alone all 10 of them. So if we can show, for instance, in Building 7, which we'll start with, that these characteristics are evident, then we've pretty much proven that we have a controlled demolition. In addition, we look for government documentation because and foreknowledge, because controlled demolitions are planned months in advance. It takes teams of people, months of planning and engineering and placement of explosives. So we have foreknowledge. People know that it's going to happen. We'll be looking for these things also in the case of Building 7 and the Twin Towers. And of course, we have plenty of video documentation, all of which supports the hypothesis of controlled demolition. Well, let's take a look at Building 7. Again, it's this 47-story skyscraper, half the height of the Twin Towers. It's only dwarfed by its proximity to the towers, which once were the highest buildings in the world, at least for a year. And it would be the highest building in 33 of our states. Is Oregon one of them? Do you have a high-rise taller than 47 stories? Okay. So, you're one of those. And it wasn't hit by an airplane, of course. So it doesn't have some of the drama that the Twin Towers had with the jet fuel and the fireproofing being knocked off by the airplane. That's why we start with Building 7. It has an easier set of characteristics. Now, it was about a football field away from the North Tower. And as you'll see, it contains it had some damage as a result of the collapsing North Tower, which you can see here. About 8 scattered fires on various floors. Fairly small relative to high-rise fires, as you'll see. It did receive some damage from the structural beams which were hurled laterally out of the Twin Towers. It collapsed in the same day on 9/11, about 7 hours after the towers did. And so here's fires this is a 47-story skyscraper. Don't be confused by the shadow from the Verizon building. 12th and 13th floors contain the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this fire is on the opposite side of the building from the damage. You can see the Twin Towers already fallen here, Building 7, beyond. The Securities and Exchange Commission lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we have some investigation that needs to be done that was not done. We had a lot of smoke on one side. Now, if this building had massive fires through open windows, which would allow the smoke to go through, how would you expect this building to fall? Kind of like that. So we'll be looking to see how Building 7 fell. Well, let's take a look through the evidence and see how it applies starting with, is there a rapid onset of destruction at the base? Let's listen to this emergency worker.
The building actually was on fire, the bottom floor of the building on fire, and we heard this sounded like thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, looked like there was a shockwave flipping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and horrifying. Then, about a second later, the bottom floor came out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then most of our house, we saw the smoke and the smoke coming in.
The sound of a clap of thunder, a shockwave ripping through the building, and windows busting out. This doesn't sound like a fire-induced collapse, and then the building coming down, he says. Let's take a look at CBS shot, Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are our shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now go to videotape the collapse of this building. Amazing, incredible picture word. For the third time today, reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much of television before. A building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down. That's an intuitive field that Dan has on the first day. He never repeated those words. So, do we have a rapid onset of destruction and a straight-down symmetrical collapse? Let's take another look from this shot from West Street. Some people think these are squids or explosions, others don't. You can do some research and decide yourself. So it appears that we have a rapid onset, straight down symmetrical collapse, but I'm not quite convinced. Let's do a side-by-side comparison to a known controlled demolition on the right. This is Italian. So, very, very similar. So this is the kind of research we would have expected from our agencies, which we pay homage to, NIST and FEMA. Do we have a collapse into its own footprint? Pretty much. There's a slight overlap. Do we have demolition waves that remove column support? Well, there are 24 core columns in this building, 57 perimeter columns. In order to bring a building straight down symmetrical, what you have to do is take out the core columns within a tenth of a second of each other. And then half a second after that, you have to take out the perimeter columns. Now this is a feat, once again, that only half a dozen companies are capable of. So we have to ask ourselves the question, can fire do what only a half a dozen companies are capable of at this precision? Again, fire, of course, being an organic process. These are the key questions that we have to ask ourselves. Do we have a free fall speed of collapse through the path of greatest resistance? Well, in this split video photo, you can see the gaining downward momentum of the building second by second, indicating that the columns gave virtually no resistance to the force of gravity. You can overlay the drop distance on a graph of time, and it fits the curve, the theoretical curve of free fall. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, we had a 47-story skyscraper. It got reduced to 4 stories. There's no air left between all of the debris. In other words, that steel frame, which was welded in a moment frame or welded frame configuration, all of those connections had to have been cut to create such a condensed, compact file. Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Yes, the post office on the left, the Verizon building on the right have received virtually no damage. Do we have sounds of explosions? Let's listen to whistleblower Craig Barton.
And the whole time we hear boom, 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 boom. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it. You know? I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down. And running away from that sucked. That's one of the things I live with all the time. And I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down on me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did. And a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
I'm not yet convinced. Let's listen to Kevin McPadden, former Air Force Special Operations for Search and Rescue.
He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it would sound like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Okay, the question we have to ask ourselves, do fires respond to countdowns as they destroy buildings? Number 8, enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. Do we have those? Watch this incredible advancing wave of pyroclastic clouds marching 35 miles an hour down the streets of lower Manhattan in every direction. Now this is much more intense actually than normal controlled demolition because it's a particular type of cutter charges that appear to have been used. We'll get into that. But first, do we have pools of molten iron? In this case, we're looking at the chemical evidence of cutter charges, but in other kinds of evidence of cutter charges as well. The World Trade Center structural engineer, Leslie Robertson, was on site, and he reported to an engineering conference. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. Chief O'Toole, seeing a crane lifting a beam vertically from deep within the catacombs of Ground Zero. It was dripping from the molten steel. The fires took 3 months to put out.
Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basements of the World Trade Center, where 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock, hot spots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
What are we talking about? We're talking about surface temperatures first. 1,340 degrees on the area over Building 7, and even hotter, 1,400 degrees almost over the Twin Towers. These are surface temperatures. There's no fire on the surface of Ground Zero after the collapse. These are recording temperatures 6 stories down in the basement as the molten metal was dripping down there. What's the problem with this picture? Office fires are only up to 900 to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel doesn't even begin to melt until about 3,000 degrees, 2,700 degrees. We're missing 2 to 3 times the amount of temperature required to create the molten metal. Where is it coming from? We're going to be taking a look at a possible suspect, thermate. You can see in the jaws of this backhoe the dripping molten metal coming off the debris. Look what happens to this steel.
The steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself. Bent, deformed, without cracks.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of seismic and how there's no cracks in the iron. It's bent without a single crack. It takes 1,000 degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically, no buckling and tearing on the tension side. There's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in their lives.
Explosives also deform steel. As they fire, gas pushes outward. The force of the gas can easily bend a large steel column.
Fires burned and molten metal flowed, and the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel, and concrete, and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And almost like a chunk of lava from Kilauea or Iceland, where they're very sharp but breakable shards on the end here.
Now, what is the problem with all of this molten metal? This is John Gross, lead engineer of NIST, as he answers some tough questions by some 9/11 truthers. Or tries to.
I was curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the tower. And
tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but my witnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers. And some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel. And physics professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, he found evidence of thermate residue, which would explain how the buildings collapsed by means of frequent explosions. So, have you analyzed the steel for those residues?
First of all, let's go back to the basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, there's no eyewitness who says something would produced it.
You get down below and see molten steel running down the channels. Like you're in a foundry. Like a lot.
Delta Boots is one of the biggest things. Out still in the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
This is how expensive they were. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We got some small windows into what we thought was a board at some point, and it looked like an oven. It was just board inside. This is a bright reddish orange color.
I know of absolutely nobody, there's no eyewitness who says something would produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yard, so I don't know that that's so. But
why are the representatives of our government that we pay our tax money to lying through their teeth about the molten steel? Is it because they cannot produce with the elements of the official story the almost 2,000 degree difference between? So where did it come from? Well, first let's hear from some other first responders and demolition contractors. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center. Saw melting of girders, the structural engineer who was hired to examine the steel at the World Trade Center. Molten metal beams just totally have been melted. Steel flowed in molten streams. Molten steel in pockets now being uncovered. Red-hot metal beams excavated from deep beneath the layers of subfloors. Seeing molten steel. Molten metal which was still red-hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, molten steel beams. The streams of molten metal that leak from the hot cores flow down broken walls inside the foundation hole. Molten metal dripping from a beam. Beam would be dripping with molten steel. Still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall. Debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Looked like a vat of molten steel. Far beyond a normal fire, it is nearly impossible to draw conclusions about it based on other fires. Pieces of steel being pulled out, still cherry red. What produced all the molten metal? Let's take a quick look at thermite as we continue our effort in the scientific method, gathering data to support a possible hypothesis.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Let's take a look at this thermite and see if there's any evidence of it in the World Trade Center and Building 7. Well, this is a 40-pound chunk of it sent to Dr. Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. Now, if thermite were used, it would leave a signature. And materialsengineering.com, a rather famous engineering company, says when thermite reaction compounds are used to ignite a fire, they produce a characteristic burn pattern, white, yellow, hot liquid. Intense white reaction zones. These compounds are rather unique, and they contain unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese in abundance, and iron and aluminum and potassium as well. Manganese, these are the elements that are the key suspects that we'll be looking for. Well, Dr. Jones finds that the previously molten iron is, in fact, predominantly iron. It's not structural steel. It's not aluminum from a jet plane. We know it's not structural steel because it has very little chromium. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, key ingredients in thermite, and it has magnesium and fluorine in abundance. These are extremely unusual, and they don't occur in the normal office fires. Fluorine is an oxidizer used in thermite charges. Now, let's take a look at this example from a Clarkston Memorial from the World Trade Center 7 steel. This piece was put into a sculpture, and Dr. Jones performs X-ray efflorescence on slag from the ends of this beam. He also finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Now, if gel explosives were used, these would be very, very tiny aluminum particles and iron oxide, and they're extremely powerful. They can be cast into shape, like this recently patented linear shape charge, where you pack gel explosives in and detonate, and it's forced through the opening to a piece of structural steel, which would end up looking like this piece from World Trade Center 7. Has anybody here ever used an oxyacetylene torch? This is the torches that they used at World Trade Center 7. Do you cut in and out like this? And it's a very clean cut. This is not the kind of cut we see from the iron workers out on the field. Fire, nor does fire do this to steel. We already discussed fire temperatures. They don't melt steel. This is melted steel, as is this piece with residue of aluminum left behind, one of the second key ingredient in thermate. But sol gels, if they were used, would leave a telltale residue behind, 1,3-diphenyl propane. And lo and behold, the EPA's Eric Schwartz said this particular molecule that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. And here it is in all the dust from the World Trade Center. My goodness, documented by EPA. How about these iron microspheres? This is quite a mystery. In all of the dust in the World Trade Center, such as this dust here, and about 4 or 5 other samplings from around the Brooklyn Bridge, this dust from an apartment across the street, and another piece, sample from a nearby rooftop about 2 blocks away. Well, Dr. Jones puts a magnet to this dust, and he finds that all this metal comes up. Well, much of this metal is these round microspheres up to the size of a 1/16 of an inch, most of them, however, smaller than the human eye can see. So how in the world were they formed? Well, if you had thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and nano-sized particles of thermate, you would have a fairly explosive incendiary. Now, it would atomize the byproduct of thermate, which is molten metal, in the air under the pressure of the explosives. Similarly to this water bottle, which has to be putting out 1 million of these tiny spheres. Why are they spheres? The surface tension forms the liquid into spheres. That's just what it does. Raindrops are not tear-shaped. They're actually spheres. Don't be fooled by the cartoons. So that's how, the only way most people can imagine how these spheres were formed and ended up in the dust scattered from river to river across lower Manhattan. So he finds in these spheres, interestingly enough, all of the chemical evidence of thermate. This is a classic controlled experiment where he does XEDS, electrodispersive spectroscopy, and compares it to the spheres. They're virtually identical to a controlled experiment with thermate, where it's set off with a magnesium stick, powdered aluminum and iron oxide and these other elements. So this is the smoking gun of 9/11, if there is one, directing us to some very, very key information about what was done and possibly who may have been responsible. Now, Dr. Jones is not the only one, and the 2 physicists and a geologist that he's working with that finds the spheres. This is corroborated by EPA's or USGS analysis of the dust, as well as R.J. Lee's analysis that they performed on the rooftops of the Deutsche Bank building nearby skyscraper across the street. So it's corroborated. It's not just a few lone quacky scientists making this stuff up. Now, this would explain the 1,000 cars that have corrosion on their tops, because this is very corrosive, especially as they're cooling and still hot, these tiny microspheres and all the dust. It might also explain why hundreds of first responders are dying who are breathing this stuff, iron-rich microspheres, smaller than the eye can see, airborne, basically. Well, manganese, toxic substance not found as a result of fires, is also found in abundance and found particularly on top of the Deutsche Bank building. So Dr. Jones concludes that given the mix of these trace metals present, including manganese, barium, zinc, and copper, that it's clear that significant aluminothermic reactions occurred and that this stuff must have had in it originally, before its detonation, aluminum iron oxide, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, sulfur, and potassium permanganate, which makes potassium. But it gets even more interesting. About 3 months ago, he began to look deeper into the dust, and he finds these tiny chips up to the size of a 1/16 of an inch, which also respond to the magnet. And they come up, and he analyzes them, and they're gray on one side, red on the other. The red side appears to be, as he does his electrodispersive spectroscopy, once again, it's tiny particles, nano-sized particles, very, very high-tech thermate. You can't buy this stuff on eBay. It's only being developed now by Lawrence Livermore Lab, and they're putting out articles on it finally. So it has iron, aluminum, sulfur, potassium in the same basic ingredients as unexploded thermite. So again, we have smoking gun with the unexploded thermite. This is a close-up, and these particles are, I forget what nano size. A nano is a thousandth of a millimeter. Is that true? Somebody tell me.
Thousandth of a micrometer.
Thousandth of a micrometer. What's a micrometer?
It's a thousandth of a millimeter.
A thousandth of a millimeter. So a millimeter is about a 16th of an inch. These particles are a thousandth of that. That's the size. You can't just do that in your garage. And you can't do it in a cave either. We'll be coming to that. So he concludes, based on with these other scientists that he's worked with, doing the EDS, XRF, EMP tests. We're talking about experimental results, an important part of the scientific method, which we expect our government to apply as well. They identify predominantly iron, along with fluorine and manganese, aluminum and sulfur in these, as well as 1,3-diphenyl propane. That this is compelling evidence that thermite reaction compounds were deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. But that's not all. So back to Building 7, now that we've added 9 and 10, we have these 10 characteristic features which go to provide direct evidence for the explosive destruction of World Trade Center 7. And once again, the fires cannot produce any one of the characteristics that we just went over. Normal office fire, and even normal office fire with jet fuel. Jet fuel, by the way, is a normal hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter. It's basically kerosene. It's not a magic elixir which can tear buildings down. It burns about 900 to 1200 degrees under ideal air-fuel mixture. So we have no characteristic of destruction by fire. We have every characteristic of destruction by controlled demolition. So this goes to set toward our support of the hypothesis, but let's just do a little more research here. Most buildings don't fall due to fire-induced collapse, most high-rise steel frame buildings, that is, because there's a couple of reasons. One is that they're protected with fireproofing in 2 and 3 hours on the columns and beams throughout the building. And remember, Building 7 was not hit by an airplane. Neither were these buildings, which sustained very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires. And over 100 examples, such as this New York building, burned 6 hours over 5 floors. In LA, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. Very hot, large, and long-lasting fires. 17 hours over 26 floors in this Venezuelan high-rise building. Not one of these buildings or any other high-rise has ever collapsed due to fire. And yet, due to the few randomly spaced small fires in Building 7 and a lot of smoke on the south side, we have a collapse in about 6.5 seconds. That's very interesting. Well, what does FEMA do? If the background research doesn't support the fire hypothesis, don't report it relative to all of these buildings that don't fall due to fire. Is there data from the NIST and FEMA reports? Well, indeed, we have a series of investigations through 2001, 2002, and 2005 in NIST report, but all of these investigators virtually carried through each of these investigations. Starting with the American Society of Civil Engineers, they were called volunteers. Well, these are not your average PTA volunteers. These guys are in $10 million contracts with the Department of Defense. Not what you would call an unbiased investigation. They have a stake in maintaining their relationship with the federal government. And they have expertise in blast resistance, not fire collapse resistance, interestingly enough. Well, 2002, FEMA finally got some funding, $600,000. They received, to compare that, by the way, to the affair between Bill and Monica Lewinsky, $40 million of your tax money. And the third worst structural failure in modern history is only $600,000. A very, very interesting juxtaposition of values. 2002, the Silverstein-Weidlinger report came up and reversed the theory of FEMA, and that theory, which we'll get into right now, soon, carried on into the NIST report. In the NIST report, interestingly enough, well, it receives a little bit more funding, $20 million in 3 years. But what does FEMA say first? The collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting an internal failure and implosion. Sounds an awful lot like controlled demolition. Did they look for evidence of controlled demolition? No. Did they find any evidence? They say no. Well, how could you have found it if you didn't look for it? Well, they answer this question, and they actually suggest that, well, why would we look for something we would never find? That's the actual answer. It's a circle of deceit. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. After $600,000 of your tax money, they don't know what caused the collapse. That's very interesting. Listen to this. The best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, and then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. Their best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. Very interesting. If you get to this point, and your best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence, what are you supposed to do? Construct another hypothesis. Was that done? No. So, if the conclusion doesn't support the fire hypothesis, punt. And that's exactly what they did, and NIST has now picked up the ball, and we'll look and see what they have to say about it. But, unfortunately for those investigators hoping to resolve the issue, much of the evidence has already been destroyed, and by FEMA, systematically at 800 truckloads a day, against the railing of the fire protection engineers who claim, rightfully so, that